The morning Dr. James Calloway cleaned out his office, the hallway outside his door was completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of early mornings before the hospital woke up, but the specific, deliberate silence of people who knew what was happening and had quietly decided to look the other way. 15 years. That was how long James had walked these corridors. 15 years of arriving before sunrise, of skipping lunches, of staying 4 hours past the end of every shift because somewhere in this building there was always one more patient who needed him. And on this particular Tuesday morning in November, all of that had been reduced to a single white envelope sitting on his desk when he arrived. He had stood in the doorway for a moment before picking it up. He already knew what it was. The letter was brief, formal, and completely bloodless. It cited a billing irregularity in his department. It mentioned an internal audit. It used phrases like operational restructuring and mutual separation as though those words softened anything. James read it twice, set it down on the desk, and then did something that would have surprised anyone who knew him. He smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did, deeply, in the way that only a betrayal from something you genuinely love could hurt. He smiled because somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he rarely visited out loud, he had seen this coming for almost 3 years. He pulled the cardboard box from the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he had placed there 14 months ago, just in case, and began to pack. The photo came first. It was a small framed picture, slightly faded now, of a 7-year-old girl named Rosa who had been brought into the ER on a January night 8 years ago with a ruptured aorta and a 2% survival chance. James had operated for 11 hours straight. When it was over, when the monitors had stabilized and the room had exhaled, he had sat on the floor of the scrub room with his back against the wall and cried quietly for about 4 minutes. Then he had washed his face, stood up, and gone to check on his next patient. Rosa had sent him that photo the following Christmas. She was riding a bicycle in it, grinning at the camera, missing her 2 front teeth. He had kept it on his desk every single day since. Next came his father's stethoscope. Old, slightly worn at the earpieces, but still perfect. His father had been a general practitioner in a small town in Ohio for 31 years. He had never been wealthy, never been famous, never published a paper or spoken at a conference. But when he died, 412 people attended his funeral. Patients, neighbors, the man who ran the hardware store, the woman whose twins he had delivered in 1987. James had understood something important at that funeral. He understood that medicine, at its truest, was not about prestige. It was about presence. He placed the stethoscope in the box beside Rosa's photo. There was nothing else worth taking. He carried the box down the corridor himself. No cart, no assistant. Just James, walking the same path he had walked 10,000 times before, past the nurse's station where 3 people suddenly became very interested in their screens, past the attending lounge where 2 colleagues he had trained personally turned their backs at precisely the wrong moment, down the elevator, through the lobby, and out through the glass doors into the cold November air. He put the box in the back seat of his car. He did not look back at the building. What he did do, as he sat in the driver's seat for a long, quiet moment before starting the engine, was take out his phone and send a single text message to a man named Richard Holt, his attorney, his oldest friend, and the only person in the world who knew everything. The message had 3 words. It's time, Richard. Because here was what the board of Mercy General Hospital did not know. What the administrator who had signed that termination letter did not know. What none of the colleagues who had avoided his eyes that morning could have possibly imagined. For the last 3 years, quietly and methodically and with the kind of patience that only a man who spent his career performing 12-hour surgeries could sustain, Dr. James Calloway had been buying shares. Not in the hospital directly. Mercy General was part of a larger parent company, a healthcare conglomerate called Arden Health Partners, whose stock was publicly traded and whose board of major shareholders met 4 times a year in a glass tower in downtown Chicago. James had begun purchasing shares through a private investment firm 18 months into his suspicion that something was wrong at the administrative level. He had never discussed it with colleagues. He had never been flashy about his finances. He drove a 6-year-old car, lived in the same modest house he had bought when he first joined the hospital, and spent his money on exactly 3 things: his work, his small investment portfolio, and the annual scholarship he funded in his father's name for medical students from low-income backgrounds. He was not a man who needed to be seen. He was a man who paid attention. And what he had been paying attention to, for 3 years, was a pattern. Equipment budgets cut while administrative salaries rose. Experienced nurses quietly pushed out and replaced with agency staff at lower rates. A billing department that had changed leadership twice in 18 months. Small things, individually. But James had a surgeon's mind, trained to see the body not as a collection of separate parts but as a single, connected system where one small irregularity upstream always, eventually, produced consequences downstream. He had started buying shares the month he first noticed the pattern. By the morning they handed him that termination letter, he owned 11% of Arden Health Partners. 11% was not control. But 11%, in the hands of the right attorney, with the right documentation, and the right 2 phone calls to the right 2 people on the shareholder board, was leverage. And leverage, James had learned, was simply patience made actionable. Richard had already prepared the paperwork. He had been preparing it, in careful stages, for the better part of a year. All he had been waiting for was the trigger, the moment the hospital made a move that was documented, official, and irreversible. A termination letter with a forged audit attached to it was about as official as it got. James started the engine. He drove home, made coffee, and sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours, reading through every document Richard had sent to his secure inbox. The share transfer agreements. The shareholder proposal. The legal brief outlining the billing fraud, because that was what it was, properly named, that had been occurring in the administrative office for at least 22 months. He read everything once, carefully, the way he read pre-op charts. Then he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Eleanor Vance, a senior member of the Ardent board who had privately expressed concerns about the hospital's management direction at the last annual meeting. She picked up on the second ring. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, she said, "Send Richard the paperwork tonight. You'll have my vote by morning." The second call was shorter. 5 minutes. A different board member, different concerns, same conclusion. By Friday, 3 days after the morning he had carried that small cardboard box to his car, Dr. James Calloway held 53% of Arden Health Partners. He owned the hospital. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't post anything, didn't call anyone who had avoided his eyes in their hallway, didn't respond to the 2 awkward messages colleagues had sent that week saying things like "so sorry to hear the news and if there's anything I can do." He simply went home each evening, reviewed the documents Richard sent, signed what needed signing, and slept soundly. Because this was never about anger. James was not an angry man. He had spent his entire career in rooms where anger was a liability, where clarity and calm and the ability to make a precise decision under impossible pressure were the only things standing between a patient and the worst moment of their life. He had trained himself, over 15 years, to feel everything and act from none of it. He felt the hurt of that Tuesday morning. He acknowledged it, the way he acknowledged pain as information rather than instruction. And then he focused on what came next. 6 weeks later, on a cold Wednesday morning in December, he stood in front of a mirror in his bedroom, adjusted the collar of a charcoal suit he had not worn in 2 years, and picked up his father's stethoscope from a dresser. He didn't put it around his neck, not yet. He simply held it for a moment, the way a person holds something that grounds them. Then he placed it carefully in his jacket pocket, picked up his phone, and sent Richard one final message. "We are ready." He walked out to his car, backed out of the driveway, and drove toward Mercy General, toward the same glass doors he had walked out of 6 weeks ago carrying a box with almost nothing in it. This time, he was bringing something back. The receptionist saw him first. Her name was Donna, and in 11 years at the front desk of Mercy General, she had developed the particular skill of reading a room before anyone else in it could. She read people the way some people read weather, not from what they said, but from how they moved, how they carried themselves, what their eyes were doing when they thought nobody was watching. And when the glass doors slid open that Wednesday morning and Dr. James Calloway walked through them in a charcoal suit flanked by 2 attorneys carrying leather document cases, Donna understood everything in approximately 3 seconds. She stood up so fast her chair rolled back and struck the wall behind her. James didn't stop at the desk. He didn't need to. He gave Donna a single, quiet nod, the kind that said "I see you," and "you're fine," and kept walking. His shoes were unhurried on the polished floor. That was the detail people would remember later, when they talked about that morning in the break rooms and parking lots and staff lounges of Mercy General. Not the suit. Not the attorneys. The fact that he walked like a man who had nowhere to be but exactly here, and no reason to rush because everything was already decided. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor. The conference room was at the end of the hall, and through its glass wall, James could already see them. 6 members of the hospital's administrative board, seated around the long table, papers in front of them, expressions arranged in the careful neutral of people who had received legal notice that morning and had spent the last 2 hours deciding how to look. At the head of the table sat Gerald Marsh, the chief administrator, the man who had signed the termination letter, the man whose name appeared on every internal memo that Richard's team had spent months quietly collecting and documenting. Gerald looked up as James entered. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite guilt and it wasn't quite fear. It was the particular expression of a man who had spent a long time telling himself a certain story about how things worked, and was now watching that story encounter reality. James pulled out the chair at the head of the table. His table. He sat down, set his father's stethoscope on the surface in front of him. Not as a gesture, not for effect, simply because it was in his pocket and he wanted it where he could see it, and opened the single folder Richard had prepared. He did not look up at Gerald. He did not make a speech. He simply began. The first item in the folder was the reinstatement list. 14 nurses. All of them let go over the previous 18 months under what the official documentation had called budget realignment. James knew every name on that list. He had worked alongside most of them for years. He knew that Patricia Osei had 3 children and had been at Mercy General for 9 years and had never once called in sick. He knew that Marcus Webb had been the best trauma nurse on the night shift, and that the ER's response times had measurably declined in the 4 months since his departure. He knew these things because he had paid attention, because that was what he did, because attention was the first instrument of care long before any surgical tool entered the picture. He slid the reinstatement paperwork across the table to the HR director. All 14, he said. Full reinstatement, back pay for the period of absence, and a written apology from the hospital. Richard will send you the template. Nobody at the table spoke. The second item was the investigation file. It was thick, 47 pages of documented billing irregularities, internal communications, and financial records that Richard's team had assembled over the course of nearly a year. It named one person specifically. It named Gerald Marsh. Not as a bystander, not as a negligent manager, but as the individual who had knowingly authorized falsified billing records across a 22-month period, had used those records to justify departmental cuts that funneled money upward, and had ultimately used one of those fabricated audits as the instrument to terminate the employment of a physician who had begun asking the right questions. James placed the file in front of the board's legal representative. "You'll want to read all of it," he said. "Your legal team already has a copy." Gerald opened his mouth. James held up one hand, not sharply, not unkindly, simply with the calm authority of a man in an operating room who needs one moment of quiet to make a precise decision. Gerald closed his mouth. James looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. "I'm not here for you, Gerald," he said. It was said plainly, without heat, without theatre. "I want you to understand that. What happens to you next is a legal matter and it will proceed through the appropriate channels. But my reason for walking back through those doors this morning has nothing to do with what you did to me. It has to do with what this hospital is supposed to be." He closed the folder. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked around the table at the faces watching him, some relieved, some uncertain, some visibly moved by the simple absence of cruelty in a moment where cruelty would have been so easy. "I didn't come back for revenge," he said. "I came back for my patients." The room held that sentence for a moment, the way a room sometimes holds something true. Then James picked up his father's stethoscope, slipped it into his pocket, and walked back out into the hallway. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic. It was methodical, careful, and deeply human, which, if you knew James Calloway, was exactly what you would have expected. He hired an interim administrative director while the board restructured. He brought in an independent auditing firm to conduct a full review of every department's financials over the previous 3 years. He met personally with the head of nursing, the head of the ER, and the chiefs of every major surgical department. Not in conference rooms. In their actual spaces, the nursing station, the trauma bay, the scrub room outside OR3 where James himself had stood thousands of times. He listened more than he spoke. He took notes on a small yellow legal pad that he carried in his jacket pocket, and every note he took became an action item, and every action item had a name and a deadline attached to it. Patricia Osei came back on a Monday morning and found a card on her locker. It was handwritten. It said, "Mercy General is better with you in it. Welcome home. JC." She told people about that card for years. Marcus Webb returned to the night shift in the ER and within his first week had already trained 2 junior nurses in a triage protocol he had developed on his own time during his months away, because Marcus Webb was exactly the kind of person who could not stop caring about the work even when the institution had stopped caring about him. James heard about the protocol, requested a copy, read it that same evening, and by the following week it had been formally adopted as hospital policy. The structural changes moved steadily forward. A new patient advocacy office was established, a dedicated space, staffed by 2 full-time advocates, where any patient or family member could raise a concern without navigating the administrative maze that had previously made such concerns disappear quietly. James had drafted the proposal for it himself, late on a Thursday night, at his kitchen table, with coffee going cold beside him. It was, he believed, one of the most important things he had ever written. The billing department was rebuilt from the ground up. New systems, new oversight protocols, an external compliance officer reporting directly to the board. The kind of infrastructure that made fraud not just illegal, it had always been illegal, but genuinely difficult. James understood that rules without architecture were just wishes. He was back in the operating room by the second Thursday. He had cleared it with the new interim administration, resubmitted his surgical credentials through the proper channels, insisting on that, specifically, because he wanted no one to be able to say the process had been bypassed, and was cleared within 4 days. His first case back was a complex cardiac repair, 8 hours, a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher named Bev who had been waiting longer than she should have because scheduling had been in disarray for months. When it was over, James sat in the same scrub room where he had sat after Rose's surgery 8 years ago, back against the wall, and was quiet for a few minutes. Not from grief this time. From something harder to name, a fullness, maybe, or the particular piece of a person who has returned to exactly where they belong. He washed his face, stood up, and went to check on Bev. Within the year, Mercy General's patient satisfaction rating climbed from 2 stars to 4. Staff retention reached its highest point in a decade. 3 regional medical publications ran features on the hospital's turnaround. James declined every interview request. He wasn't interested in the story of what had happened to him. He was interested in what the hospital was becoming. On the 1-year anniversary of the morning he had carried that small cardboard box to his car, James arrived at work before sunrise, the way he always had. He walked the corridors in the early quiet, past the nursing station, past the attending lounge, down toward the ER where the night shift was finishing up and the day was about to begin. Donna was at the front desk when he passed. She looked up and smiled. He nodded, that same quiet nod from the morning he came back. Some people leave quietly, and return like thunder. And then, without any noise at all, they simply get back to work.